going.
And
Yes,
you keep it in the archive
we
of
keep
the
it in the
synagogue.
archives. Yes, and I will talk to you about the copyright aspect at the end. So, Nelly, could you begin by telling us your name, when you were born? Was it Polish?
Well, it was a Jewish name.
Yes.
My father's name was Podhoretz,
Yes.
which you
Pod-
Leon Podhoretz,
Your father's
and
name.
that was my original
Your
name.
yes. And your first
And I was
name?
given a Jewish name. We were always given a Jewish name and an equivalent in Polish.
Yes.
So my Polish name was Nelly with a Y, Nellly,
The same.
which is the name of a little heroine from a Polish classic for children. And my Jewish name was Nechama.
Chava. And when were you born?
And I was born in 1933.
And in which city?
Well, there's some controversy. I mean, on my papers say that I was born in Warsaw. I suspect that I was actually born in Lemberg, where my parents lived, and where I spent my early childhood.
Right, just a moment. So that's where you were born, and your mother's name was.
My mother's name, I only really know her Polish name, sadly
Yes.
enough. It was Antonina,
Antonina.
and from Linden from home. That was my
Certainly.
grandparents.
Right. Now, we have, Nelly, your interesting account of your childhood, which I'm privileged to have a copy of, but I'll ask you a little bit more. Your family were, would you say, middle class, or?
I would say they were middle class, possibly lower rather than upper middle class. They were. They lived comfortably, but certainly not in any luxury. My father worked as a salesman for a big firm. He was a traveling representative of a firm which manufactured fountain pens and pencils, something like this. It was a very, very famous firm in those days called Hartmut. And my mother was at home, looking after the home and after my sister and myself. And I suppose you could say that they were comfortably off because we had a maid, which in those days was not a very great luxury. Any more or less middle-class family would have had a girl, a living-in girl, who from somewhere from the villages. Ours was a Ukrainian little girl who was helping mother with the house chores.
And your respective, your grandparents, did you know, which of them did you know?
I knew both grandparents, in fact. I remember more distinctly my mother's parents. My father's parents were totally Orthodox. They were completely Orthodox. And I just remember very vaguely, they unfortunately perished in the war. I remember the grandfather wore a beard, and certainly grandmother wore a sheitel, and they were absolutely strictly Orthodox. My mother's parents, I think her mother was much more strict with the Jewish tradition, although I mean my mother's father was a man of a lot of flair, I think, and not absolutely strictly bound, I think, by all traditions. Although he, by all accounts, I would say that he was definitely following the Jewish tradition, as the majority of people would have in those days. He was by no means an assimilated person. Both households were kosher households and kept very strictly all the Jewish holidays and most of the traditions of the Jewish home. And I remember my mother's parents more because we used to My grandfather was a bailiff for a huge estate of some Polish noblemen, and he looked after the estate. And as part, I suppose, part of his payment was that he was given a big farmhouse, which was his home, and an orchard and a bit of land, I think, which was for his own use. And there were various domestic animals and so on. So I think they lived very comfortably. And all I remember about my grandparents is that we used to, they were parents of 7 sons and daughters, all of whom were married, all but one. My mother was one of 7. All but one were married and had families, and for the long summer holidays, the family, particularly the women and the children, used to congregate in the farm, on the farm where my grandparents lived. So I used to spend summers in the farm there, which were very, very wonderful memories. So that's my mother's side of the family. My father's parents, I just remember there seems to have been a little less contact with them. I mean, we probably visited them. I don't have very clear recollections. You see, I was 6 when the war broke out and everything went to pieces.
So your parents were integrated in the Jewish community in Warsaw, obviously?
Well, that was in my early childhood. That was in Lemberg, not in Warsaw.
Lemberg, the German name, the Polish name being?
Polish name is Lwów.
Yes.
Lwow, but the O with a comma on it, read as U.
Yes. And so you moved, right, so your childhood up to the war was in Lemberg?
Was there and within the war as well.
Until you were moved.
And we were taken to the ghetto
Right.
in Lwów, in fact.
What sort of, how big was the Jewish community in Lemberg or Lwów? No, I
That
don't
is
know.
something that I really can't tell you.
Because you don't remember the synagogue or?
Do you know, I don't, although I'm quite certain that we must have been taken to the synagogue, I mean my sister and myself, but I truly can't remember that.
So
I remember the Shabbat at home, and I remember Pesach at home, and I remember Yom Kippur at home. I remember all those events, and every Erev Shabbat I remember the sort of special atmosphere and the preparations and how Shabbat was celebrated. I remember my father laying tefillin every morning, and these sort of memories I have of our of how Jewish tradition was kept in our home. I do not remember going to the synagogue, although I'm quite certain we must have.
did you go to school? You were 6 when the war broke out. Had you started going to school then?
No, you know what happened? The war broke out, and there was this, the Germans moved very fast through Poland. And then, I can't remember which year, this is where historical facts have to be consulted. But there was, we were for a short time under German occupation, and then there was a pact between Hitler and Stalin. And Hitler returned some territories to Stalin. So we found ourselves under Stalin's occupation for a while. And then I went to school, and I remember then learning Russian at school.
You still remember
As well as
Russian?
Not really, no. Because this was for about a year or a year and a half before the second big offensive of Hitler's forces, when he pushed on and took the rest of Poland and then went on to Russia as well. And then Hitler established the ghettos in eastern Poland, and this is when our Holocaust experiences really start.
So that was another...
That will have been, I don't really know, it might have been 41.
Right, no, we can check that.
But that we
Yes.
have to check.
See. So that then made a great difference in your life when the Germans came.
Well, that was the beginning of this incredible catastrophe, really,
Yes.
yes.
and you
And I remember that my father asked mother. People knew that Hitler was coming, and people knew that it was extremely dangerous. And my father approached my mother and said, hundreds and hundreds of people are escaping on trucks with the Russian army as the army was withdrawing from the territories around us. There were many Jewish people who were going with them because they did not want to remain if Hitler was coming. And my father asked my mother, should we pack and also run away with the people who are going to Russia? And my mother, who had built up with a lot of care and a great deal of devotion and work, built up her lovely home, she said, how can we do that? How can we leave our home and just run away with a rucksack on our back? And well, within not a very long time afterwards, she of course it was all brutally taken away from her.
And how much do you think your parents knew at that time of what Hitler, what the Germans' policy to the Jews was?
Of course, that would have been very difficult for me to know as a child. I mean, if they knew whatever serious things they knew, they would not have talked in front of us about. In fact, even the episode about my father asking mother, shall we go, I only know from having heard about it later. Yes.
And you didn't feel able to discuss that point with your mother later?
Not really. Oh no, because it was a very painful thing. I think that mother probably has never quite recovered from feeling that she has made a horrendous mistake, and father in fact was later on murdered by the Nazis. So.
Yes. So we have here, Nelly, your account of how you were into the ghetto in, now which
This
point?
was the Lemberg ghetto.
Was it?
The Lemberg ghetto.
And you escaped from that ghetto through the ghetto wall, and then went into hiding?
We did. There were lots of things happening. We were helped. I mean, my sister was nearly executed. My sister, who was 8 years older than myself. Oh yes, I did go to school. I'm sorry. You asked me whether just started, and it was either the kindergarten or the first class at school, because I did go to a school, a Jewish school, and I was learning Hebrew. And my sister, who was 8 years older, was already in what was called the gymnasium, which is the high school, and she was learning Hebrew as well. And it was a very famous Jewish school in Lemberg. It was called the Jagielloński Gymnasium. Now suddenly I remember this. And I went just, either it was a first class or preparatory or kindergarten or something like this, just before the first onslaught of the Nazis. And later there was this exchange between them and the Russians, so I then went to school, and it was a Russians-run school. And then when the Nazis took over again, well, there was no school at all then there was just hiding and a lot of horrendous events succeeding one another. While in the ghetto, of course there was no question of school. We were constantly under threat of being exterminated in the ghetto, and we were constantly trying to hide, and there were these attacks. They would arrive in lorry loads and start gathering people for execution, or taking them to transport them to concentration camps, or to transport them to horrendous places like forests, where they would make people dig their own graves and then execute them into the forest. And my sister was caught into one of those transports, and she managed to escape, and she was barely 16 at the time, I think.
Did you heard where you were in the ghetto, what was going on?
Yes, it was known, really. We knew that if you were taken on one of these transports, you were going to your death. That was known, absolutely. Because there were very occasional escapees from these places who spread the word. And my sister managed to escape before she was taken to one of these terrible places where several hundred people were dug a ditch into which they were all shot. Um, and she was in such a state of hysteria, literally, and when she came back, she stole her way back into the ghetto, and then she said, "They're not going to slaughter us like this. We're going to escape." And through the intensity of her feeling, it gave an impetus to the family, and a contact was made with people outside the ghetto. In fact, one of my mother's brothers was outside the ghetto. This is all in the manuscript. And he had quite a lot of money, and it was also not only did he have the money, he was very generous with it, and was doing everything he could to help people to be saved. And he had contacts with non-Jewish people who were some because of their ideology and some because it afforded them a means of earning money, were doing various things to help to steal people out of the ghetto. And they were producing false Aryan papers. And so that was arranged for us. First my sister got out in that way, and then my mother and myself, and 2 days later my father was to be brought out. We were actually brought out under the nose of the guards of the ghetto by a man who passed himself off as an SS officer, and he was in fact he was a Jew who lived in freedom as an Aryan, because he was not Polish, he was Czechoslovak.
He was Polish.
That was Dr. Yes, Poldi. What was his name? It should be there. Leopold Pavlovich. Leopold Poldi, we called him. And he spoke perfect German, because most of the Czech intelligentsia were educated at German universities. So being Czech and speaking perfect German and being a doctor, he just passed himself off definitely as an Aryan, and sometimes simply acted as a Volksdeutscher and put on a German national, and had a supply of all sorts of false papers and uniforms and everything, and he did extraordinarily courageous things, and he walked as an SS officer through the guards, through the main entrance to the ghetto, gave them a few orders, and walked out with my mother and myself. And he was going to do that 2 days later to save my father, by which time my father was taken to one of the most horrendous places, prisons outside the ghetto, where there were tortures and executions, and that was that.
You can remember the instant as you passed through out of the ghetto gates, I suppose?
Very vaguely, you know. I must have been in such a horrendous state of panic and fear that some of these memories are quite blurred. I remember certain things. I remember us hiding in the ghetto during one of the so-called actions, when a drunken lorry load of SS would arrive with machine guns and start trying to catch as many people, to load them up on the lorry and to transport them either to Auschwitz or possibly to some other place of horror. Some of these moments I remember. I don't actually remember that very moment of walking out of the ghetto, but I remember being outside with Dr. Pavlovich and a Polish, really not a Jewish nurse, who helped him a great deal in all these extraordinary endeavors of his, of saving Jewish people. And we stayed with them, and she in fact taught me how to behave like a Catholic, because it's a totally Catholic country, and if you are to live amongst the Aryan population and not give away your Jewish identity, one had to learn how to behave like a Catholic. And there were all sorts of traditions, how you prayed at night before you went to bed, and what prayer you said when you were at the table, and how you entered a church, and how you behaved in a church. And I was given, I think we spent about 2 weeks, and I was given a very quick, basic Catholic education to be able to act as a proper Catholic, because we were about to embark on a journey to Warsaw, where we were supposed to hopefully live amongst the Aryan population on our false papers, pretending that we were somebody else than we actually were, and so try to save our lives.
Talking of learning to be Catholic, can you say how much you felt up to this time that you were Polish as well as being Jewish? Because you say here how separately the Jews had lived from the Catholics.
I think that as a child, there was a very, very clear distinction between the Jews and the non-Jews, but they were not called Jews and non-Jews. We called them the Poles and the Jews. Although we spoke Polish, and to all intents and purposes, we were just as Polish as the other Poles, but we were Jewish.
Yes.
So we, in fact, called them the Poles, unless in Yiddish we call them Goyim.
So you left Poland at a relatively young age. Did you feel, how much of that time, did you feel really a sense of Polish nationality or identity?
It's a very great mixture. This is a very interesting point. I think in some ways I felt very Polish because of the culture, and of course because of my musical gift and my connections with Polish music. And as I grew to be a teenager and I began avidly to read literature and poetry, I felt tremendous closeness. And I was also very gifted in writing, and that was my language. So you see, I was, in one sense, I was very, very Polish. I was very Polish, and yet I was a complete outsider, psychologically. So it's a tremendously ambiguous position.
Indeed, yes. Well, returning to your story, you were brought on the train to Warsaw, and did you get to Warsaw to mix with the Aryan population there?
Well, that's why I can sit here and talk to you. Yes, we did. I mean, all that story, in fact, is there were many, many events which kept us on the verge of disaster, of losing our lives, followed these two weeks of our preparation for going out into so comparative freedom.
Yes, just briefly.
And there were many very dangerous moments where we just managed to, where we brushed up against death, literally, and managed to survive.
I see briefly you found a room on the outskirts of Warsaw with a family called
Topolski, that's
and
right.
You lived there for how long?
I'm not absolutely certain. It might have been as much as a year, but I'm not certain.
And then you...
Possibly not, because there somebody began to suspect that we were Jewish, my mother and myself, and they sent on the police onto us, luckily the Polish police, and they were very bribable, and my mother happened to have money with her which she had just received from this kind uncle of mine, and so she stuck it into their hands, and they didn't take us to the police station for further investigation, and after that we had to leave the place because it was too dangerous to stay, so we started looking for other places. And then my mother was advised by my uncle that the best thing she should do is to go and be a maid somewhere, because it was a very class-structured society before the war, and that spilled over during the war. And the wealthy people were looking down upon their servants, certainly, and normally people who were servants were illiterate peasants on the whole. So mother was to pretend that she was a very simple woman who could hardly read and write, and become a maid in somebody's home in Warsaw. And there were still plenty of people who had money, although the war was on, and there were shortages and people lost a great deal. But there were always people who had money and who were looking for domestic help. And domestic help there meant living in help. So my mother took me by the hand, and we looked at advertisements in the local papers, and looked for a position as a maid, and that led to various adventures. First of all, many people didn't want her because they saw her with a little girl, and they would shut the door in her face and say, "Oh, sorry, we don't want a person with a girl, with a child." But eventually we did find a home.
With Mrs. Kowalski, was this? Kowalski family?
Yes, do you note how extraordinary? When I wrote it, I remember their name, and now I don't. How extraordinary. Being in the swing of writing this, yes.
So you
And they had 2 children, and we lived with them in Warsaw. It was an extraordinary situation because they shared an apartment comprising 2 bedrooms and a large kitchen. They shared that apartment with their parents-in-law and with us, my mother and myself. So mother and me slept on a small iron bed that was arranged for us in the corner of the kitchen. And one couple was with 2 little children was in one of the bedrooms, and the elderly couple in another bedroom, and my mother and the other lady were cooking on the same stove in the kitchen in which we both lived. And we were thrilled that this was great luxury. We had a roof over our heads, we had food, and mother was tucked away in the kitchen doing her chores as a maid, and nobody was asking her any questions. She wasn't meeting people, she wasn't exposed to public view, which was extremely important for us. It was the closest to hiding that we could come. But even there were moments of danger. Because at one point the young woman who employed mother came once home and said, "Oh, I think we are all, I have had a phone call and I think we are in somewhat of a danger." And she just indicated this, and we realized that somebody had phoned her to tell her that she's keeping a woman with a child who is probably a Jewish woman escaped from some ghetto. But my mother was so indispensable to her that she didn't do anything about dismissing my mother. She took the risk of keeping us and hoping that whoever it was that was trying to blackmail her about it would shut up and not do anything about it. But we realized that it was getting dangerous. But then other dangers came. In fact, then we went through tremendous horrors as Aryans, because the big uprising of the whole of the city of Warsaw started. This was after the uprising of the ghetto and after the complete liquidation of the ghetto of
How
Warsaw.
much you knew about what was going on in the ghetto?
Oh, it was hard not to know, because the Warsaw sky was red when the ghetto was burning. It was literally red.
And you, of course, could do nothing to help.
There was nothing. we were. There was nothing we could do. We suffered in silence and just thanked our lucky stars that we were on the outside. But there were very horrendous things. I mean, I told you there were the 2 couples living in the apartment. The elderly couple, parents of the young men, the father was an absolutely bitter anti-Semite. I mean, they were anti-Semitic for absolutely no reason. I don't think they quite knew why they hated Jews. There was a kind of raw anti-Semitism in Poland that was totally without foundations. It was bred into them. It was in their bones. I have heard in a church in Poland a priest after the war saying, "And the Jews killed our Lord." And I mean, this was preached to them and this was taught to them in more than one way. And if you were born into a Catholic family, part of your upbringing was to become an anti-Semite. It went with mother's milk. So this old man who was there, obviously facing not too long his own death. In fact, his own death came in a very terrible way, very shortly afterwards, stood on the balcony and watched this red sky and the burning ghetto and said to my mother, "Well, Hitler knew how to get rid of them." To which my mother, who was absolutely shattered, said, "You know, you shouldn't talk like this. Our turn may come also," pretending us, we were then one of them, as it were. And within a few months, this man was executed by the Nazis when the Polish uprising came. So there were just constantly these horrendously dramatic, awful encounters.
While you were in this hiding in Warsaw, your mother was working in the kitchen. What happened to you? You had no schooling? You had anything to do?
No, my mother realized that, I couldn't go to school because they might have found out. I might have given myself away in one way or another. So I was with my mother in the kitchen helping her with her chores, and mother took it upon herself that she would keep me educated to the best level she could. So she would put books in front of me one after another, and I had to read a lot, and I had to sit and copy pages and pages of writing. And then the family with whom we originally stayed in Warsaw, where we were first approached by the police and whom we had to leave, the Topolsky family, had a girl of exactly my age. And we were very friendly, and they realized that we were Jewish, and they tried to do their best to, although it was never openly spoken of, they did their best. They began to call my mother auntie, and they made me call their mother auntie, so that they tried to pretend that they were our family, in a sense, to help us to cover up. They were very wonderful people, very, very wonderful people. The mother was in fact a school teacher. And what they arranged was that the girl was coming several times a week to where my mother and I lived, and was going over with me all the schoolwork that she was doing. So I was sort of schooled by proxy, plus this extraordinary thing that my mother did very cleverly. This probably led to my great fluency in the Polish language and quite a considerable literacy, because when after the war, have we finished? No. When I went to school after the war, my use of the language, I had a very rich vocabulary and very fine use of the language, and I was writing very well. So much so that my teachers suggested I ought to become a journalist and a writer. And I'm sure that these days during the war, when mother was forcing me to read more and to copy pages and pages of good literature, must have given me a tremendous background for the language.
Extraordinary.
So that kind of education I received. What is more, in that kitchen, on our iron bed, living on our iron bed, between the two bedrooms where the two couples were living, who incidentally were not on speaking terms with each other, there in the midst of all these dramatic events, I realized that the elderly couple had a piano in their room. And I began to nag my mother that I wanted to play the piano. I have already played the piano, started before the war as a youngster, and it was obviously, people recognized that I had considerable musical talent. And I started having lessons very young, but all that was interrupted with the ghetto. And then I heard the piano, and I was absolutely drawn to it, like a bee to honey, and I didn't stop nagging my mother until she finally consented to ask the old lady whether I could go to that piano, and she gave me strict instructions that I mustn't show that I know anything, because we were supposed to come from very simple background, and she was a very simple, uneducated woman. How suddenly would she have a daughter who could play the piano? But in any case, I tried my best to hide, but I didn't apparently succeed to hide my talent very much. And eventually there, they had arranged for me to have piano lessons with a teacher who used to come once a week to give their young daughter lessons, a teenager, daughter in her late teens, who was having lessons there. And so in the midst of all these horrendous events, and basically our task was to do everything we could to survive, to manage to survive extermination, there was I, engaged in piano playing, on my literary pursuits and piano playing. In between helping mother to wash and clean the babies and carry the coals up to the kitchen and sweep the floor and whatever, there was I also playing the piano and making extraordinary progress until the old lady teacher said, well, your little girl, I don't think I can teach her anymore. She ought to go to the Chopin school in Warsaw, which absolutely horrified my mother because she did not want me to go anywhere in public in case I would be recognized and taken away. So there were all these contradictory things happening in our lives.
And somehow, with the resilience of the young, you managed to keep going.
Yes, that was, I think that probably that was my mother's, that is what saved my mother. I doubt that she would have gone to such length of and found such energy for surviving various very, very difficult moments had she not had me to look after and had her purpose not been to save me. And I can remember a point where we had to escape. This was in fact the point where the woman said that somebody had telephoned, we were all in great danger. And we were walking around in the streets after curfew, playing a sort of cat and mouse game with the Nazis patrolling the streets. And at some point my mother just sort of collapsed and sat down on a doorstep somewhere, and she said, oh, my child, I can't anymore. And I went up to her and I said, oh, mother, but you see we'll survive, you see it'll be all right, with an extraordinary conviction and power. And I made her get up and go on. And I'm quite certain that I gave her strength to continue, and I must have been, my presence must have been absolutely essential to her survival, I think, which was our survival.
So you moved, you say the Warsaw Uprising began in street fighting,
Yes.
and you were still then living in the center of Warsaw?
With that family, with these two families, who meanwhile my mother managed to bring on speaking terms, okay?
And so then you escaped, but you...
Then we did not escape. From that there was really no escape, because the Nazis were going systematically conquering street after street, burning down the houses, executing men on the spot if they found any men.
Now why was... Because this was
Because
of
the
general
whole of
Polish
the
uprising.
Polish nation in Warsaw went up in arms, whatever, you could hardly call it arms, Molotov cocktails and whatever they could get, against the German occupation. So every person of Warsaw was then considered to be a complete criminal, and they were taken, either they were executed there and then, or they were taken to Auschwitz just as the Jewish people had been taken. And many Poles perished in Auschwitz. Many Warsaw Poles perished in Auschwitz.
So you were herded into this place in the center of Warsaw and then put onto a train,
That's right, for Auschwitz.
and
And miraculously that train stopped somewhere outside Warsaw in the middle of a field. And the order came, alle Frauen und Kinder raus. All women and children out. And we thought that they were going to shoot us in the field, and in fact they didn't. They bundled us into some disused church and kept us there overnight. What transpired later was that they were beginning to be in a panic. You see, this was towards the end of the war. They were pushed hard by the Russians.
Yes.
And the Russians were in fact brutally standing on one side of the river in Warsaw and allowing Warsaw to bleed itself to death and to be destroyed totally by the Germans. And they didn't say, they could have saved a lot of lives, which they did not care about. But the Germans were feeling the pressure, and they were in a panic. They had overloaded themselves, I presume, in Auschwitz by that time. And this particular transport, they released all the women and children because they could not have taken them into Auschwitz anymore. And that's how I what Providence arranged for us to escape Auschwitz.
then you found shelter in a neighbouring village.
That's right.
Who arranged this? You say.
Well, we were in that church overnight, and then they just let us disperse. They just opened the gates of the church and they said, out. And we were absolutely with nothing, just the clothes that we were in. And as it happened to be a hot summer's day, I happened to be literally without shoes. I just had a little dress on and I was barefooted. And my mother had a pair of shoes and a dress, and that was all we had. We had absolutely nothing, not a penny to our soul or anything, just what we stood in. And the people of the surrounding villages were all extremely supportive, of course. It was a heroic outburst of the Warsaw people to try and fight the Nazis. So there was tremendous support of every kind that they could muster. And when they had discovered that there was this transport of people from Warsaw, suddenly dispersed in the field there, and people came forward and began to take us in, as it were. So they took us and into the neighboring village, a whole number of us, and gave us shelter and food. I was given a pair of shoes by somebody. And people brought whatever they could. They gave us some more clothes to wear, and they gave us. People began to bring. They made space for us in a disused. It was a pigsty. It was a pigsty which they whitewashed, cleaned up and whitewashed. And so one person gave a bed, one person gave a mattress, one gave a stool, one gave a little table, one gave a primus stove. And so a little corner was arranged for my mother, myself, and Mrs. Topolsky, the very first Polish family that we lived with. Somehow she was in that same mass of people that came out of Warsaw. And I can't remember how we met up with her, but there she was again with us, sharing this pigsty. So there were, and her daughter, who was pregnant at the time, by a young man that she was in love with, who perished in the fighting against the Nazis. So there was this young pregnant girl, her mother, my mother and myself in a tiny little pigsty on 2 iron beds again, with various primitive gifts that were given to us by people.
Let's be at the end of this side. Right. So continuing, Nelly, you spent the war. You spent 1944, as you say in this account, in this living in this pigsty.
It was at the end. It was the summer of 1944. That I remember because we were in fact liberated in that village, which will have been May 45, and I do know that it was a summer. And that later there was a winter, and winters in Poland can be very severe, and there were various further developments to do with my playing. There was a lady there who discovered that I was very talented, and she was quite a wealthy person and had a lovely home, and she lived alone. And she arranged again for me to have lessons. In the midst of all this piano playing kept coming in. And I was having lessons, and then she fed me, and she made boots for me for the winter and gave me warm clothes. And because we were literally absolutely in complete poverty. My mother was didn't know how to earn a few pennies so that we could buy some bread for ourselves. And she managed to, she spoke to somebody in the village in a kiosk, and they said, well, if you could supply us with cigarettes. Cigarettes used to be sold individually.
Yes.
And so my mother started, and they used to be homemade, as it were, some. people bought empty cigarette filters and tobacco, and had little special instrument that filled this filter with tobacco. And then mother would stand in the corner of the street, and passers-by would sometimes buy one cigarette, or they would buy 5 or 10 or whatever. And I stood with mother and sold these cigarettes on the corner of the street. And from that she would make a few pennies, and as soon as she earned a little bit, she would go and buy me a glass of milk and a roll. And one thing that I remember, which is rather touching, to do with my mother, who so very conscientiously kept her Jewish tradition, and kept very conscientiously a kosher home and so on. I remember the first time mother earned some money from this sale of cigarettes. She said, "Come, child, I'll get you something really nice." And she took me to a kiosk where they were selling glasses of milk and a roll with a piece of ham in it. And she fed me on this roll with ham and a glass of milk, and her eyes were shining with joy that she could give this to her child. And of course, I think she herself possibly never touched ham. I don't know how she managed it during the war, but she considered it a mitzvah to feed me on it when she was able to buy this for me. So this was rather a touching incident.
So with that, you must have been just getting charity from the other villages?
Yes. But people gave whatever they could. Nobody had too much, except for this wonderful lady who sort of took me under her wing and decided and wanted to help as much as possible. So when winter was coming, there were special boot makers, and she ordered a pair of boots. She said that she was making boots for herself. She did it also in a very noble way. She said that she was making boots for herself, and there was a lot of material over, so she told the man he should make a pair also for me and my mother, so that both of us would not freeze in the winter, because Polish winters without warm boots are just not possible to survive. And she gave some warm clothes to my mother and to myself, and people helped, everybody helped who could. And mother was sitting through the night and filling her cigarette filters. In the daytime she would sell them, and she began to earn enough for us to eat, which was all we were hoping for. And miraculously she began to earn, I mean, comparatively very well. There was really enough. She could buy whatever we needed.
She could get her supplies from wholesale or whatever middleman.
Yes. Then she started getting supplies, big supplies of cigarettes, and selling them to the kiosks and the shops, rather than standing in the street and selling them one by one. So she was earning more in that way. It was an extraordinary time. And there again every now and again we had to hide, because what the Germans again were doing was, from time to time, they would raid the village and look for Warsaw people the way they looked for the Jews in the past. Anybody who had a Warsaw identity card, which they call Kenkarte, with a Warsaw stamp on it, was liable for execution or for concentration camp. So we again had to hide, not as Jews, but as inhabitants of Warsaw, because our only papers were stamped with the Warsaw stamp. So the children of the village were trained to run around to wherever there were these survivors of the Warsaw uprising, and warn us. And on several occasions, I remember, we had to hide because there was the SS were coming to the street where we lived, looking for Warsaw people.
You would hide there.
So it was really, literally, up to the last minute before we were liberated by the Red Army, we were in constant danger.
So eventually, you had to have a heart in your mouth when they came, but in between you somehow.
In between, when the SS were not actually raiding, and then we lived amongst the people of the village, and Nobody knew that we were Jewish, of course.
Again, you were not able to go to the school, presumably?
Oh, of course not. Of course
No,
I didn't
no,
go to school.
riding.
No.
Okay.
But I had my piano lessons, and I was making great strides with my piano playing. And I still continued what mother did with me before. I continued to have to do my reading and my writing every
Where
day.
did you get books from? You fled without anything?
We fled without anything, but oh well, that was no problem. I think
People
she must have.
lent books.
Yes. Because she just was very worried that I should not be illiterate. So, and then one day, that I remember very clearly, we were sitting in that place. By then, Mrs. Topolsky and her daughter had found some other contact somewhere, and they left this pigsty which we shared, and they went to live somewhere else. I think they closer to Warsaw, probably. In any case, we were then alone, my mother and myself, in that little place, which was like a tiny little. It was like a shed. It was the size of a bigger garden shed. There was just room for 2 single beds, and there was a little stove in the middle, and a tiny little table and some tabourets. It was with one little window, tiny window. It had been a pigsty, and this was where we lived.
And then you had a little bit more space then.
Then we had a little, it's like the Jewish story of the man with the goat. Yes, then we had a little bit more space, the two of us. And one day, this was in the morning, and I remember mother was milling around doing something, about to go about her business to sell her cigarettes or something like this. And somebody knocked on the door and came in and said to her, "Mrs. Zachaczewska, have you heard?" This was my mother's Polish name, our adopted name, because we adopted, with the false papers, everything, all our details changed then. Have you heard that the Germans are gone? And I shall never remember my mother's expression, and she almost fainted.
Never forget.
I'll never forget, I'm sorry, yes. She was absolutely stunned, and she didn't sit down, but her body collapsed into the chair, and she was completely, I thought she was going to faint. She could not take it, and she couldn't believe it. And he said, "Yes, come out, all the people are out in the streets, the Russians are coming in their tanks." And eventually she gathered herself together, and I went with her. And there were hundreds of people in the streets of the village, and the tanks were going through the village with the Russian soldiers and some of the Polish people who had joined the Russian army with them. And the tanks were covered in flowers. People were throwing roses onto the tanks, and flowers were thrown. This was May 45. And they were cheering and greeting them, and everybody was tremendously overjoyed. And then I remember how in the crowd, certain people began to sort of look around in a very strange way, look at others. And eventually they began to certain people would approach certain other people and would say, "Amhu, Amhu." And this was the word for "Are you a Jew?" I don't know where that came from. I never quite understand. Am Yehudi in Hebrew, I suppose, whether the Am must have been, Am Yehudi is the Jewish nation. But they were saying Amhu, Amhu. And whoever answered to that word Amhu, you knew that this was another Jew who had somehow survived and come to this crowd. And there were several individuals. These were extraordinary events. So there were here and there spots of Jewish people who somehow survived some of them survived in the canals of Warsaw, from the ghetto. In the sewers, yes. In the sewers. some in hiding, some like ourselves on false papers. There were various people who
Do
tell them.
you recall something of your feelings that you could now be a Jew again?
Well, no, because we did not feel safe. I mean, it was so deeply ingrained, the fear of admitting that you are a Jew, that except for those that we thought were also Jews, we did not tell anybody that we were Jewish. And in fact, we still remained in Poland for another 5 years. We emigrated to Israel in 1950. And except for our close friends, nobody knew that we were Jewish. And many people who then remained, who did not emigrate to Poland, the ones who did not, there were amongst them quite a few who did never let on that they were Jewish. They kept they were the only papers people will have had were the Polish papers. And there were quite a number who were so fearful still of admitting their Jewishness. And we in fact did not, although my mother meanwhile started proceedings after the war, after Israel was created, and it became known that there was an immigration possible to Israel. Mother immediately started proceedings to get papers to be allowed to emigrate to Israel. And we left Poland without telling the majority of people who knew us anything about our Jewishness
Or where you were going?
or where we were going.
Yeah.
We just wanted to leave it all behind. And you see, we were so filled with horror and so filled with this awful, psychologically it's an extraordinary thing. And if you keep beating a person all the time and calling him a dirty Jew, he begins to believe that he is a dirty Jew.
Yes, I can understand.
Somehow, and he somehow says that there's a part that doesn't want to admit it, but mainly out of fear. Anti-Semitism was just so deep and so widespread, so omnipresent, really. Yet one must say that there were, of course, quite many Poles who have done wonderful things to help Jewish people. We encountered those people. The Topolsky family, they knew very well that they were endangering themselves by pretending to be our family, as it were, and keeping up with my mother and myself and trying to do everything they could. There were other people who did wonderful things. There were some people in the church who helped. There were obviously, but the majority of people perhaps were indifferent, and there was a minority with a bitter hatred of the Jews who were only too happy to denounce them to the SS, the Gestapo.
Can I just go back there just briefly? I should have asked at the beginning, talking of your grandparents, your family on both sides had lived in Poland as far back as you know of, did they? Or?
Yes. My grandparents didn't come from other countries, that I know. So I do not know further than
so
that.
You were Polish Jewish stock as far
Yes.
as you know, and
Yes.
so here you were now in an anti-Semitic country
Yes.
as far as goes back.
I still have an uncle who's surviving in Poland. And he indeed is one of those whose Jewish identity officially has been kept from the knowledge of other people. But I did in fact write to him when I was writing these memoirs to ask a few details about my grandparents, their names and so on. But I never actually asked how far back the family goes in Poland, and I don't know how much he knows. But I will try to write again and get that information from him.
Yeah. So here you were at 1945 when the Russians had come, and you were age 12, was it?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you went back to where your memoirs really stop. You say you what really happened to you after the war then? You found your sister again?
We found our sister. Well, we constantly kept in touch with her, although we couldn't be together for various reasons. She had different papers, and we couldn't pass on as one family.
Yeah.
And she went through a whole other chain of extraordinary events. We found her. She. Well, I immediately just threw myself into studies.
You found
And
her
I was
in
accepted.
Warsaw?
Not in Warsaw was ashes.
Yes.
There was not a building, an upright building in Warsaw
So where were you then?
after the uprising.
Was it near Warsaw?
No, we went from the village where we stayed. Very shortly, we went to Lodz,
Oh, yeah.
and there I was immediately accepted to the conservatory
Lodz, yes.
in Lodz, and we spent a short time there, and then we, again, my wonderful uncle who had been helping us throughout the war, who had been financially supporting us, we discovered that he survived, and we found him again. And he suggested to my mother to go further southwest to Katowice, where we could find a very, very, very modest little apartment. And my mother began to work. She went to work in an office. In fact, she worked in the Ministry of Health. She was a bookkeeper. And I went to school. There was a very famous music school in that place, where all the finest Polish musicians who managed to survive, the musicians from Warsaw, established a very fine conservatory and music high school, something along the lines of the Menuhin School in this country. And I was accepted to that school. And from that moment on, I never looked back as a musician. I mean, I went from strength to strength. I gave my first recital when I was public recital when I was 13, and I was always chosen out of a school of about 300 musically gifted children to be one of the 4 or 5 soloists in big concerts that the school was giving. At one point, the director of the school came up to me and he said, you know, when you finish the school, we are planning to send you. There are always 1 or 2 outstanding students whom we are sending to Moscow for further studies. You have been chosen as one of them. And so I was very thrilled about it, and I came and told my mother, and my mother's face fell, and she said, well, we are going to emigrate to Israel. Which I didn't greet with very great enthusiasm at that moment, because I had no idea what Israel was like, except that I was told that in Israel conditions were very tough, and probably I should have to stop playing my piano, because there are other things to be done in Israel than to play the piano. And so I was quite devastated, because it was the most important thing in my life, very obviously. And I promised a career, and I was promised to be sent to one of the greatest centers of music of the world, to Moscow for further studies and all this. And my mother was going to take me to a country where all people were doing was digging the earth and building roads and working on the kibbutz, and nobody was interested in pianists whatsoever. And little did I know that, in fact, in that wonderful, wonderful little country of ours, I blossomed out. I happened, Providence had its hands in things, and I met a very remarkable American woman who had come to the country, having retired from the Juilliard School of Music.
Well, can I go to Russia? You're jumping forward. We'll just stop and come back to this. Then just ask Katowice, there was some sort of Jewish community there that you...
I had absolutely nothing to do with any Jewish community. And I wouldn't know whether there was one or not. There was a few individuals that we knew. I don't know if there was a Jewish community after the war. I doubt it. I
visited the cemetery. There's a small.
After the war?
Yes, when I went there.
There may have been a few individuals like ourselves.
There's a small community, but you weren't in contact.
Not at all.
And in the school, the conservatory, there were
no
other Jews that you know of.
I was called Ania Zahaczewska, as I was called during the war, and there were no Jewish people in the school. unless there were some who were like myself,
didn't.
who did not admit.
Yes. So you were studying piano and
I was studying.
Did you get
It was called a music gymnasium and lyceum, which is the Polish system of school. It's like gymnasium goes up to the equivalent of O levels here, and the lyceum goes up to the equivalent of A levels, from which you then continue to university. So I was in the gymnasium initially.
How much did it say?
And we studied everything, all the subjects that you study in the high school. Very sophisticated school, including Latin, math, physics, chemistry, Polish history, international history, English, French, very wide spectrum of education, plus harmony, counterpoint, music history, various chamber music, various other things, because it was a school specializing in educating musicians. But they were given the total general education that any high school gave, plus we simply had a greater load of work, plus musical subjects incorporated into our curriculum. And I joined a literary society. As I said, obviously I had become very, very literate. Instead of being illiterate, not having gone to school, I was much more literate than many of the children who had been to school. Also, there were many older pupils at that school, because there were also non-Jewish youngsters who during the war were prevented from being able to go to school. And so there were some who came to this high school who were 20, 18, 20, 21 even. So it was a very extraordinary gathering of young musical talent. And several of my colleagues then are today leading musicians in Poland.
So you obviously enjoyed this.
Oh, this was a wonderful, wonderful creative time. It was really like coming out. It was a Jekyll and Hyde existence that I experienced, coming out from hell into sunshine. And I was very successful, and I was singled out, and I was given lots of honors and a special Chopin scholarship and a piano from the government. And as I said, I just never looked back once I joined that school. I was tremendously successful.
We just go then to when you went to Israel. I think we stopped in camp another day. And what was it like? So you went with your mother and your sister to Israel?
No, my sister was separate, in fact, because she had met within a few days after the war, after we were liberated. She had met a Jewish young man who came with the Red Army, who was a Polish boy, joined the Red Army, and she met him, and they were married. He became her husband. So she lived independently. She was by then 19,
so how did you
almost
feel
20.
Your mother and you set off for Israel, and you packed up?
I was in fact 11, I think, when we were liberated, because she was 19, and the 8 years between us, or coming up to 12 possibly. I was 11, still at the time.
You were 17 in 1950 when you went to Israel?
I was 16.
16. How did you packed up your music and your...
Yes, I wasn't able to take my piano. We were only able to take personal belongings. And we had no money, and we came to Israel, and we were in an immigrants camp with hundreds of other families in tents. So we started all over again, except that we were not persecuted.
I think that you probably want to stop. I don't want to rush. I think I would like to hear more from you when we come back another day and take the story through there. And okay, then we're continuing your camp in Israel.
In Haifa, there was.
How long were you there?
It had a special name, something Aliyah, Mahne Aliyah, the camp of the Aliyah in Haifa. Where people were received by the hundreds. Then they were coming out of all the Russian satellite countries, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc., arriving in newly born Israel. This was 1950. And I mean, there was hardly any. There wasn't enough food to go around in Israel, and certainly there were no dwelling places for all these new immigrants. They were not received as they are received today, where everything is waiting for them ready. Um, Bags of DDT were poured over us as we arrived in these camps to prevent the spread of disease and God knows what. And we were given another iron bed. I seem to have spent my life on iron beds. And a little mattress, and the blanket, like a military grade blanket, and the Primus stove per family. That was our survival kit.
Was your mother depressed, or what did she
I was thoroughly depressed. My mother was depressed. It was horrendously difficult. From that, it was a sort of transit camp. From that camp, we were allocated into Jerusalem, into a Machne Aliyah. It was called Talpiot. There was a very big Jew immigrants camp in Jerusalem, in Talpiot, which is on the in a lovely place of Jerusalem, where there were a few sort of sanatoria type guest houses, because it overlooked the Judean mountains on the Arab side. Talpiot was the westmost point of Jerusalem in those days, were divided Jerusalem. And it was a disused British Army camp, and there were barracks that the British Army had left behind. And into those barracks we were bundled in. 12 families per barrack, per one long sort of thing. You can imagine the conditions there, and some public latrines. And so this was our first home in Israel, with the Primus stove next to our bed, and with no money, with no knowledge of the language. People were communicating between. There were families from various countries in Europe. Much of the communication was either in Yiddish or in German between the Hungarian, Romanian, Polish, etc. Jews. I discovered, to my astonishment, that I could speak German because, as I mentioned earlier in the manuscript, my mother was educated in Graz, and she and her brothers and sisters very often would speak German to each other so that the children shouldn't understand. And we absorbed the language, so I can't be sold in German anymore. It has stayed with me. In fact, I can speak German reasonably. I can certainly understand very, very well. I probably make some grammatical mistakes, but I can get on. In fact, so I discovered that I was able not to be deaf and dumb, which I felt with my great fluency and literacy in the Polish language, which was of no use to me with anybody but the Polish Jews. So when I had to communicate with others, I started speaking German. I had also had 5 years of English tuition in my Polish school, but I soon discovered that it was very poor English that I had learned in that school, and was of hardly any use to me.
How were you taught Hebrew? Was there a good system?
Well, Hebrew I was never taught, and I speak it so well that I was giving lectures in Hebrew a few years ago. I have a very good ear for languages, and this is a musician's ear, and I began to pick it up, because within a short time various extraordinary events led to my being introduced again to a very outstanding musician who became my teacher, who brought me into the very tiny then music academy in Jerusalem. And I began to go to lectures which were on various theoretical subjects in music, which were given in Hebrew. And I would take them down in longhand in the Hebrew words as I could hear them, but in Latin writing. So I had lectures and lectures on music harmony, music history, counterpoint, various things like this, written down in Latin letters in Hebrew. And gradually I began to understand it. And gradually my other colleagues they were Israelis, Sabras, and they would try to speak to me whatever they could, some German, some English, and within a year I was speaking Hebrew with everybody.
With your colleagues, so what was the setup? How were you living and?
Well, in the immigrants camp, mother had to go out to look for some work. We had no money, and she was very, very keen on my continuing my musical studies, because it was very obvious that it would have been a tremendous pity not to pursue something that was such an evidently yes, considerable talent. So the thing mother could do, she couldn't go and work in an office, which she did in Poland, because she didn't have the language. So the first thing that was suggested to her was that she could go and do some housework. And there was a guest house run by an Israeli lady, Israeli of Russian origin, one of these early pioneers to Israel, one of these Golda Meir type women, but from Russia. Very remarkable woman. She was running this guest house. Mrs. Kronberg, whose husband was a well-known architect, had been, he wasn't alive anymore, a well-known architect in Jerusalem, built various interesting places there. And she had this guest house, and she needed somebody to come and clean the rooms for the guests. So my mother went to do that. This was her second installment of being a servant again, except that in Israel, of course, she wasn't treated the way she would have been treated in Poland. Most of the new immigrants went and did wherever they could find anything to do. They were mostly manual jobs. And my mother went on cleaning. I think, has it stopped? Oh no, it's moving. My mother went to do some work in this guest house, and naturally, like a good Jewish mother, began to talk about the wonderful daughter she had. And what a wonderful daughter, and they listened to it with a little bit of misgiving, because every Jewish mother has a wonderful daughter, and every Jewish mother has a very talented daughter. So after hearing my mother's stories about this wonderful girl who did so brilliantly in Poland and was predicted such a great future as a pianist, they decided, it so happened that one of the guests was the singing teacher of Jerusalem, an ex-German emigre, Frau Boroszek, who heard these stories, and he, together with the lady who owned the place, said, we ought to meet that girl and find out whether the woman is exaggerating or not. And they said to my mother, bring your girl, let's meet her. And there is a lady here who has just arrived from America, one of the outstanding teachers in New York. She had retired from the Juilliard School of Music, and we would arrange for your girl to go and to play to this person. And if she thinks that your girl is talented, we'll see what can be done, and maybe she herself would like to help him. So I was duly brought to this pension and introduced to the two ladies, who arranged that I should be taken to Henrietta Michelson. Her picture is just behind you there, who was a very remarkable, very, very remarkable personality. She was 65 at that point. She had retired from the Juilliard School of Music, where she taught for 30 years, and decided that as Israel was born, she had a contribution to make to it. So she, lock, stock, and barrel, sold up everything she had in New York and in Maine, brought 4 Steinway pianos with her, a huge music library, lots of donations from wealthy Jewish American friends, because the Americans were so wonderful to Israel. Lots of clothes and things that she was going to give to the poor Israelis, and 2 of the pianos were for the Jerusalem Academy of Music, and 2 were for herself. And she set up home in Jerusalem and wanted to spend her last years making a contribution to the musical life of Israel. And it was into the hands of this lady that into the home of this lady that I was brought by these friends from where my mother was cleaning rooms. And I came and played to her. And it was rather nice. I came in and she said, "You speak English?" And I said, "Yes." And so she then proceeded to say something to me, and I said, "Oh, sprechen Sie Deutsch bitte?" Because I couldn't understand. My English was obviously terribly limited from my school days. And she spoke German because she had in her youth studied in Vienna. And she listened to me, and without any further ado, she said, "Well, next week come for a lesson and bring so and so and so and so and so and so." Decided what music I should start studying. And just like that, straight away, took me on as her pupil. Much more than as her pupil, she took me on. She immediately wrote to all her friends in New York that she had this very gifted girl from Poland and they must send her clothes for her and this and that. I began to be clothed by this woman. She was instrumental in finding us a place to live in town out of the horror of this immigrants camp. And again, she did wonderful things for me. On top of which, she was a very outstanding teacher, and in fact I found in her a better teacher than I had in Poland, where I had a choice of some of the best ones. And she was to exert an influence that eventually had a tremendous impact on my life very much later. She introduced me to the teaching of Frederick Matthias Alexander, whom she had met in New York and had some lessons from him. And as you know, I am today known as one of the foremost exponents of Alexander, the Alexander technique, particularly as applied to the work of musicians and the piano in particular. And that really started with my acquaintance with Henrietta Michelson, who was vastly impressed by Alexander, having met him and having had some lessons from him, and later many lessons from one of his disciples. And she began to talk to me a lot about Alexander. She had all his books there, and said I should read the books. And she instilled in me the interest in finding out more about what the Alexander technique was about, which many years later I was able to do when I came to this country. And she again gave me my English education very much along the lines of my mother giving me my Polish education, because she said, "Well, it is all fine and good, we should speak German in your lesson, but you know, you need English. You have the English language is indispensable. So you must, I mean, if you've had 5 years of English at school, you know how to read. Here, start reading books." And there I was again, given books, Polish books I could read and understand. Whereas she put in front of me an English book and said, "Go and read the book." And I said, but Mrs. Michelson, I can't understand it. She said, "Doesn't matter, just read it." I proceeded to read a book where within a page, maybe I understood 2 or 3 words. And I thought to myself, what on earth am I doing this for? And I would turn over the next page and it was blah, 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 and suddenly some one word that I had learned at school. And I would come back to her and say, "Look, this is hopeless. I don't understand anything, and I can't sit there with a dictionary." "No, you just go on reading, and I shall start speaking English to you. And if you don't understand, ask me and I'll translate it into German." Within a few months, I was completely fluent in English, needless to say. And I was then conversing with her in English. And I started then to not understand 1 or 2 words in a sentence that I was reading. Eventually, I would not understand a few words on a page. And I had to read English books because to read Hebrew books would have taken much greater skill. And since the Latin alphabet I was quite fluent in, and I could not read Polish books, there were no Polish libraries, and my future literacy depended on the English language. So I began to read English, and I began to converse in English with her, and in Hebrew with everybody else. So I became bilingual there.
Well, do you think right. So your life, continuing your life in Palestine. How about your musical?
In Israel.
Your musical career, how did it develop?
Well, we finished last time talking about this remarkable teacher who had such a great influence on my development, on my personal development and on my musical development. Within about a year of studying with her, um, I began to appear more and more professionally. I was very young still, in my teens. In fact, what happened, as I began to have lessons with her, I had no instrument to practice on. At that point, we didn't really have a home yet. It sort of happened within some months of my acquaintance with Henrietta Michelson that we found a tiny little place to live in, which was really previously just a storeroom in a large house. And somebody very kindly cleared it out for us, and my mother and myself and my mother's younger sister were installed in that small place, which had no facilities. We didn't have a kitchen and we didn't have a bathroom. We used the bathroom of the kind person in the building who gave us that place. They were very, very harsh and primitive conditions, really, but it happened to be in the same building in which Henrietta Michelson had her apartment, my teacher. And it also happened to be not very far from where the original Jerusalem radio station was. And as I had nowhere to practice, somebody suggested that I should go to I can't remember how I met a very remarkable man who occupied a very important position in the musical world in Israel at the time. He was a very fine musician from Czechoslovakia, and he held the post of some important post in the Ministry of Education and Culture, as it was called. Somebody sent me to him to be introduced to him in case he might be able to help me in some way. And I went to see him in his office, and he had a little chat with me and asked me what I did in Poland and what I was doing, etc. And he was very charming and gave me a letter, which I of course couldn't understand because it was written in Hebrew, and said, you go to Mr. So-and-so in the Kol Israel, which was the radio, the broadcasting station of Israel, and he should be able to help you to find a place to practice. Well, I didn't know what was in this letter, and I assumed that in this letter there was just an introduction that, to Mr. Sachs to find for me a place to practice. And I went to the radio station and I met this gentleman, who then also became a friend right throughout my life in Israel. And he said to me, oh yes, if you come early in the morning, the studios are not being used, and you can come to this studio and you can practice here. But as it happens, you can come now and practice whenever it was that I was there meeting him on that first occasion. And what happened was I went to the studio and I began to practice. And then I went the next day and the day after. And after a few days, this gentleman from the radio came up to me and said, we're going to give you a broadcast. And I was absolutely shocked on hearing this. Did you want to stop it?
Yes. Do carry on.
And moving.
Yep.
Um, and he just came up to me while I was practicing and said, "Oh, by the way, we are going to give you a 15-minute broadcast. So consult your teacher what you want to play." And I went to my teacher, and I was absolutely taken aback. I couldn't believe it. And she said, "Oh, that's wonderful," and immediately started deciding with me what I should be playing for the broadcast. And in fact, that was my first broadcast. It was during my first year in Israel, and I never looked back. That's the what happened apparently. The letter which I had brought to this gentleman in the radio was written, I discovered this much, much later, by the man in the Ministry of Culture, who himself was a very brilliant pianist and musician, and who said, "I would like you to listen to this girl. I think she must be very talented." Later I asked him, "How could you say such a thing without ever having heard me?" He said, "Oh, I had a look at you and I knew that you were talented," which was amazing. So when the man allowed me to practice in the studio, he listened to me. And he decided, yes, we ought to broadcast her. So at this very early age, I think I may have been about 16 and a half or 17, I did my first broadcast for the Israeli radio. And after that, I was broadcasting regularly. Having done this 15 minutes, then I was asked to do a full broadcast, which was a half-hour program. And then my teacher got very encouraged by this. She was very thrilled that I was performing, and she suggested that I ought to play with the orchestra. So when I was less than 18, I think, or 17, I played my first concerto with the orchestra. The broadcasting authorities had a symphony orchestra in Jerusalem that was performing a public concert every week, and it was public and it was broadcast throughout Israel. So I began to play with that orchestra. All the while, I was of course a student. I was at the Academy of Music in Jerusalem, and going to my various classes on various subjects that any music student has to study. And in that first year of study, I used to write my lectures. I began to understand Hebrew fairly quickly, and in any case, to understand lectures on music was not very difficult because there are certain international terms that are used in whatever language. But I used to write down the lectures that I listened to in Hebrew, but in Latin script. And
Yes. So you carry on your lectures?
yes, I would, and of course I was surrounded by other young people. In fact, it was a very amazing group of young students at that point. Several of them became quite outstanding musicians. Some are internationally famous. Amongst my colleagues were very well known now duo pianists, Eden and Tamir, Bracha Eden and Alexander Tamir, who are very, very famous, have done a lot of performing all over Europe and the States and various places. There was a very fine singer who was one of my colleagues who, alas, died recently, but she then was taken up by Leonard Bernstein in New York, and Jenny Turrell, a very famous American singer who taught this young woman and then helped her to start a career. There were a number of people who were really very outstanding, and others who went into working for the broadcasting authorities in Israel, doing various interesting things.
Were there any particular composers at this time that you became particularly fond of, or were you just playing the general classical piano repertoire?
I'll tell you one interesting point was that my teachers in Jerusalem, in Israel, amongst them were some of the leading composers of the day in Israel. And they are today they are really names that go into the history of Israeli classical music, like Paul Ben Chaim, who is probably sort of the doyen of Israeli composers, Joseph Tal, a very, very important figure in the creative music world in Israel, Chaim Alexander. There were a number of people who were very outstanding musicians, mostly from the German background. They had been in the forefront of music in Berlin, perhaps, or in other German centers. And then, of course, with the rise of Hitler, they left, and some of them came to Palestine, as opposed to me, who came to Israel, because I came there in 1950. Some of the others had come in the 30s. And I, to this day, perform music by some of these people. As to the general great classics of music, there are a whole number of the great composers whose music is very close to my heart. People tend to say that I am specifically a Chopin player, but I don't think it's actually quite accurate. I mean, I do play a great deal of Chopin's music, and it comes very naturally to me. And some of his music, which is based on the flavor of Polish folk song, obviously it's very easy for me to perform, because I have the sense for it, and because I grew up in that country and I know the native music, etc. But I'm equally close to Mozart and Bach and Haydn and Beethoven and some of the Impressionists. I mean, Debussy and Ravel I love playing. And then things closer to our own times, various composers from the 20th century. So really my tastes are varied and wide, and when there is a good piece of music of whatever style and from whatever period, if it is good, if I respond to it directly, I feel very close to it, and at the time when I play it, that is my favorite piece. I do love playing chamber music as well as performing solo. And in fact, while in Israel, I played for a number of years in a chamber music ensemble, which was a rather unusual one. As I began to perform as a soloist with the orchestra in Jerusalem, there were some musicians within the orchestra who particularly liked my playing, and they approached me if I would form a quartet with them. And there were two flautists, a cellist, and myself. And we were all then in our early to mid-20s. And we formed this ensemble, and we approached various Israeli composers to write for us as an ensemble like this. And there was other music, that old music, and sometimes we would break the ensemble up into trios, or even playing sonatas just for two players. And we began to give a lot of concerts, and we became very, very popular throughout the country in various chamber music circles. And we began to travel around the kibbutzim and perform a lot. In fact, the two flautists were a married couple, and they were immigrants from the States. Very outstanding two musicians. Their name was Hanoch and Sharon Atel Oren. He was the first flautist of the Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra, or as it was then called the Kol Israel Orchestra. She was the second flautist. The cellist was one of the, he was the cellist, I think, of the orchestra. And so we used to meet regularly and rehearse, and we used to go off and give a series of concerts. Many of them in the kibbutzim, of course, because that's the main public, particularly in those days, in the 50s. One could give 3 concerts in a city, one in Haifa, one in Tel Aviv, one in Jerusalem, and thereby the whole tale of performing in the city ended. There were problems, because Israel being not terribly wealthy, it didn't have good pianos. Many of the places didn't have pianos at all, and so when a kibbutz had something that bore some resemblance to a piano, they would invite an ensemble with a pianist. And on one occasion we came to a newly formed kibbutz to give a concert, and a newly formed, that is, the kibbutz was about 2 years old. We arrived and we were received, as always, by the so-called tarbutnik, that's the cultural representative of the kibbutz. Received us, and they would usually take us to the communal dining hall to feed us on our arrival, and then would show us where the concerts always took place in the dining halls of the kibbutz. And I remember we came to this young kibbutz, not very far from Jerusalem, and we arrived, and several of these people gathered around us. They brought us to the table and gave us food, and they looked and looked, and then one of them said, "Which one amongst you is the pianist?" So I proudly said, "It's me." And he said, "Oh, you know this piano doesn't have any pedals." And there was I having to play a rather rich repertoire that evening. I always also played something solo in our concerts. And so I said, "A piano without a pedal, you must be mistaken. There isn't a piano born without a pedal," I said to the man. So he said, "But this piano doesn't have pedals." Well, I asked, "Where is it?" And he pointed to the piano, which stood hidden somewhere in the corner. We all went to the piano. Lo and behold, it did look completely bare underneath. It had its 3 legs and there were no pedals. So I said to him, "Look, this piano, when it was built, it had pedals, because no piano is built without pedals. So they must be somewhere." And luckily one of the kibbutz members said, "Oh, I think I saw something in the shed." So I said, "If you saw it, please let's go and get it." We brought, and we found, in fact, you know, the lyre that you have always against which there are 2 rods that go up, and they're attached to the frame which holds the dampers of the piano, and it moves up and down according to the need.
You found this mechanism.
So we found the 2 rods, and we found that lyre that they go through, but no pedals. So I said, "Well, that's all right." I explained to them what the function of a pedal was, which they didn't know, and what these 2 rods were supposed to do to the mechanism inside the piano. And I said, "All I need for you to do is to build for me 2 pedals out of 2 pieces of wood, which you've got to attach to these rods. We have 2 hours before the concert. We've got to arrange pedals." And they immediately called upon their kibbutz carpenter, and he carved out 2 pieces of wood, and the whole kibbutz was lying under the piano fixing it up for me. And it was done about half an hour before the time for the concert. The concert started, and when I put the pedal down for the first piece, the whole kibbutz clapped. It was absolutely wonderful.
So you had some experiences.
These are wonderful experiences, yes.
Yes. How long did you continue to study at the Academy of Music?
Well, I finished the whole course, then I did a postgraduate course which was called, I did a special performance diploma.
So how many years was that in?
In all, probably 4 years there, but I still continued to study. I mean, one doesn't just because one gets a certificate, it doesn't mean anything in the arts. You continue to study with the teachers so long as you feel that you need to develop further.
And all the time you were building up your performing career?
Yes, I was all the time performing. While a student, I was performing on the radio, I was performing with the orchestra every season, and then with this quartet, we used to give regular concerts everywhere.
And
so that was wonderful, because I gained a great deal of experience through performing so much.
How about maintenance, money? Were you getting? You originally had a scholarship, did you, to the academy?
Well, the scholarships in Israel, the one I got, eventually I also gave later on when I began to teach there. In Israel in those days, scholarships meant that the teacher agreed to teach for nothing. So my scholarship was that my teacher was not getting paid for all the work she was doing with me, because the institution itself didn't have any money. They couldn't possibly afford anything. In fact, the institution was a sort of cooperative of the main teachers of music who got together and decided that they ought to have a music institution. So it was run on a shoestring. Eventually, over the years, of course, the donations came, and then somebody donated. Mr. Rubin gave a great deal of money, and the Rubin Academy of Music was created both in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, with a new building, and instruments were bought. That was a wonderful, wonderful thing that happened.
So did you gradually get increasing income from your own performances then on radio and around the countryside?
Well,
not very much?
not really. The income from performances in a small country or in one country is never an income that anybody can live on.
So how
It's
did you
normally people live from teaching.
live? Yes.
And this is a widespread fact all over the world. To this day, I smile to myself when people think, because I travel a great deal and I perform here and there, that obviously this must make me very wealthy. But in fact, obviously I now earn much more than I was earning in Israel, but it's always a very there are enormous expenses when people travel to give concerts, and very often you break even, or you don't earn all that much, and then you may have months in which you don't have concerts. So it's
but in your
mostly
days,
an income of a musician, with the exception of the 5 or 10 absolutely world famous stars. The income of musicians mostly comes from teaching. It is a sort of regular income. And indeed, when I finished the academy, when I got my diplomas, I was immediately asked to join the teaching staff there. And I began to teach the younger pupils. So that was my sort of regular income. And whatever I earned from concerts was a bonus, because concerts are never very regular. It's not like going to the office every day. We don't have 5 concerts every week, and from that you could live. That doesn't exist.
So
people have a tour of. In Israel, the tours were very short. I mean, they could have been a week's tour in Israel was a lot of concerts.
So did you feel it's all rather uncertain financially, or did you just?
Oh
it
yes,
Was
always.
it something
yes.
of a worry? Was it?
Yes, except that I married very young. I was married in Israel.
Right. What was your mother? Just go back to your mother, who was with you there. And
well, my
what
mother
was she doing?
was with me until 1952 for 2 years. What happened? My sister emigrated with her young husband to Australia. And there in Australia, my sister had a very, very tough time, in fact. And she became extremely ill. It was definitely as a result of all her horrendous experiences during the war. She had a very severe breakdown. And when this happened, she was taken to hospital. And my brother-in-law wrote a very despairing letter about it, and said that the consultants all think that it would be good for her if her mother would be near. She was still very young then. She was in her 20s. So my mother very reluctantly, not knowing quite what, I was supposed to go with my mother, but it so happened that I had met this young man who rather sort of light-heartedly I decided that we ought to get married. At the age of 19 one doesn't quite realize what it may mean. And so I was getting married to this young man, and then my mother went to Australia.
She stayed for your wedding?
And yes. And then she went to Australia, and in fact stayed there for the rest of her life, as it happened. Because my sister was very ill when my mother arrived, and she was there when my sister began to recover. Mother still stayed with them. And then my sister was expecting her first child, so mother wanted to to be there to help with that. And then the second child arrived, and then meanwhile, my mother, who was a really very remarkable and very gifted woman, had begun to learn English quite seriously, and she took up a position as a clerk in the something in the office of the post office in Melbourne. And she settled down, and she was helping my sister in bringing up her 3 children. Then when mother retired, she was just there. The children were gone.
Let's come back to you. Tell me about say something about meeting your husband then, and what he was doing then, and how it happened.
My first husband.
Yes.
Well, you see, Jerusalem was such a small place in those days. It was less than half of what it is now. And the young people used to meet in certain places. And through one of these, I think through some group of young people, I met this young man who was not a musician. He was, strangely enough, he was an architect. And his mother was a born Israeli, so in other words, his mother was a Palestinian, as it were, and his father was also from Poland, but had settled in Palestine, I think, during the 30s. His father was also an architect. We met, and after, I think, knowing each other for only about 6 weeks or something like this, we decided that we have to be married. So that happened very quickly. And he worked at the ministry, interior ministry, or whatever it was called, as in town planning with a group of other architects. So in a sense, I wasn't completely dependent on my income.
Yes.
Because he had a steady income, and whatever I was earning was a nice addition to what he was earning.
I suppose you had a better place to live then when you married.
Well, it was always very difficult, but no, in fact, when we first married, we shared an apartment with another young couple. The conditions were extremely difficult. We had one room, the other couple had another room, and there was a kitchen that was supposed to be shared, and things had gone wrong there, and in fact the kitchen wasn't shared, so we had to cook in some other little corner of the apartment. They were pretty difficult. And in that one room I had my piano, and it was our bedroom and our living room and our dining room and everything. And in that room I got my diploma. I finished my studies. I was still a student when I married my husband. And then eventually we were on a list waiting for an apartment in a development that was going on very far on the outskirts of Jerusalem. By Jerusalem standards, it was very, very far out. And then we moved, and then we had an apartment of our own, which was very nice. But it was quite far from the center. And transport wasn't all that wonderful. We had to go by bus, and it was a fairly long, but again, of course, by Jerusalem standards, very long journey. But it was nice because we had our own apartment. So that was the situation. Needless to say, you see, these days young people deal with relationships differently. They don't jump into marriage after 6 weeks. They spend much longer. They probably live for a while together, and either do or don't get married after that. But it was obviously a tremendous mistake, and it began to show fairly early on in our relationship. We were, strangely enough, you see, although he was Jewish, he was an Israeli born. There were tremendous differences of background between us. It was very interesting how very far apart we were in our cultural, mental background. We really didn't see eye to eye about a lot of things out of the differences of our background. It's actually a very interesting fact, and we were not unique in that.
Was religious observance, did that
No,
come into it at all?
no, not I. At that point, well, he was totally non-religious, and I sort of vaguely tried to keep some things, and I would be laughed at. I mean, I would want to fast on Yom Kippur. He would just sit down and tuck into a good meal. And I couldn't do that, so he was poking fun at me about this. But that wasn't one of our problems. I mean, he didn't mind whatever I did about this. But there were various, very great differences between us. That eventually, we stayed married for quite a long time, but it took about 7 years until we really separated. So that was a rather fraught period. I wouldn't say that was completely unhappy, but it was fraught and tense, and there were difficulties. And but my musical work went on. I gave concerts, I broadcast, I taught, and I was for about really for most of the years of my life in Israel, and I lived in Israel for 10 years. I was studying with this remarkable woman, Henrietta Michelson, also on a postgraduate level. And then she died. She was 75 when she died. And it was a great loss to many of us. She created a circle of very outstanding friends and had very fine students. Some of the finest talent came to study with her. She was a very remarkable woman in many respects. And when she died, there were coincidences. She died, and within about a year of her death, my marriage broke down. And quite coincidentally, one of my closest friends, who was also a pupil of that woman, a very gifted pianist, happened to get a scholarship to come to London for a year to study here. And quite out of the blue one day, she heard that I had separated from my husband, and she wrote me a letter saying, she had separated from her husband. We were both young girls in our mid-20s. And she wrote to me saying, oh, it must be extremely difficult for you. I know how difficult it's been for me, because during that same year, she and her husband split up for some other reason. And you know, I'm in London and I'm learning in the Alexander Foundation. I'm studying the Alexander technique, and it's absolutely wonderful, and you ought to come here, and why don't you come and stay with me for a few weeks? I have an apartment here in London. You could stay with me. If you could just manage to pay for your journey and you would have some lessons here, I'm sure you would love it. And it was that little letter that is responsible for my being in England. I would have never thought of doing that.
What year was that?
That was that was the beginning of 1960. And in the beginning of September 1960, I came to London.
You didn't expect when you came that it would be just other than for a few weeks?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I had, in fact, in '59, I separated from my husband, and at the at the music academy where I was teaching, I spoke to the director and I said that I am financially completely now dependent on my teaching, and they were very kind, and they immediately flooded me with pupils so that I would have more income. So I had a big class of pupils who I began to teach, and more coming in, supposed to come from September. And the letter from my friend may have arrived possibly in something like May or something like this, and I laughed at it first of all. I thought, well, how can I possibly, it was so expensive to travel from Israel. If you were earning money just enough to live on in Israel, it was an absolute dream to be able to afford to travel anywhere. And I had this letter, and I walked around with this letter and showing it to my friends, saying, isn't she sweet, but how unrealistic of her. How could I go to London? Where would I get the money for that? And as I mentioned it in the street to another friend and showed her the letter, she stood and said, how much money do you need for that? And she took out a checkbook and she said, why don't you take it from me? So I looked at her and said, but when will I pay you back? She said, whenever you can. It was absolutely extraordinary. And it was a whole chain of circumstances. She offered me the money to pay for the ticket. Somebody else said, oh, I can arrange for you to travel less expensively as a student. And somebody said, oh, well, I can pay, because I had moved out of our apartment where I lived with my husband previously, and I took a room somewhere. I shared a flat with 2 other young women. Somebody else said, well, I'll take over the room while you're away so you wouldn't have to pay rent. And it's just, everything fell into place as if it had to be thus, as if I had to go.
So how did you fly, or was it the boat?
Oh no, my goodness. My trip to London, which was supposed to be a return fare, cost me, I think it cost me about £30 sterling in 1960. Well, the comfort was according to the price. This was the cheapest possible student fare, going from Haifa on a boat to Marseille, and then a second-class train from Marseille right up to Paris, and from Paris across the Channel to London. It was a tedious journey, and the boat had to be the cheapest possible available on the Mediterranean, and that was a Turkish boat. And they were notoriously awful, uncomfortable, and I was put in a dormitory or something like this towards the end of August, when the heat is unbearable, and I had to sleep next to the engines of the boat. So how I survived it, I don't know. Well, I know how I survived, because it so happened that on that boat another person was going, whom I knew from Jerusalem, another young woman of my age, and she had a cabin. She was going to London. She had some little job here in London for a while. And she discovered that I was virtually fainting at night next to these engines, and said, why don't you come and share my berth with me? And the 2 of us were sleeping on that one berth, because otherwise I literally fainted at night on the boat. And it was about 4 or 5 nights. So somehow I made it. She is one of my very closest friends here in London, from a very fine old Jerusalem family. Her uncle was later on became the president of Israel. Very, very interesting family. He was one of the. He was a chief judge, Judge Olshan, and he was one of the candidates for presidency of Israel at the time.
Now, how did London and the English strike you when you got here? You hadn't.
Well, I'll tell you, it was very interesting. My European blood responded wonderfully. I mean, I loved Israel, and it gave me this sense of freedom. It gave me the opportunity not to feel that there was something wrong with me because I was Jewish, as you understand from all those war experiences. But I was, by conditioning, I was a European and not a Middle Eastern person. Definitely. I mean, in every sense, mentally, temperamentally, physically. Although in the first year or 2 I loved the sun, after that, when the Khamsin used to start to come, and when the heat began to come down on you, I began to find you can't escape heat. Cold you can escape, you can cover yourself up, you can warm your place, but heat is inescapable until more luxurious times, right, when you can have air conditioning. But in those days, my goodness, to have a fan blowing your hot air around you was a luxury. But otherwise, one just literally had to put up with the conditions. And Israel was a very tough country in every respect. It was always fraught by insecurity. Continually, the Fedayeen were attacking. They coming across the border. In those days, we were in constant danger, day and night. infiltrators were coming through the Egyptian border, the Syrian border, the Jordanian border. There were constant attacks on civilian population.
So you have this feeling of insecurity all
Constantly,
the time? Yeah.
constantly.
Do you wake up at night to feeling worried?
Well, I think I may have mentioned that earlier on, but when the war ended, I began to have horrendous nightmares, and every night I would wake up screaming that the Nazis were after me, that they got me, or they were about to get me.
1957 was this?
No, 1945.
1945, but right,
the
well, that's
war
which, so...
But then I went to Israel, and within about a year or so in Israel, the picture in my dream, I still continue to have these nightmares for years, but the baddies in the dreams became Arabs.
Mm.
So the anxiety which was basically formed during the war years, of course, continued. It didn't have, there was no let-up for it.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I think back, for all those survivors of the Holocaust who have gone to Israel, that was not really the sanatorium that they needed.
Interesting, yes.
And I think our anxieties continued to be fed by the tremendously dangerous, uncertain situation of Israel, always.
So London was a change in that respect.
So London was a change. People were not, there were no attacks. You could sleep quietly at night. The young men around you didn't have to go to the army for 40 days every year. They weren't suddenly called in the middle of the night either for an exercise or for really some army activity somewhere on the border. It was a kind of normal life which I had not experienced for so many years. And the climate, funnily enough, now I complain certainly about the English climate, but again in the first year or two, because eventually I stayed here, I found it a tremendous relief from that oppressive heat. Now I rather like a warm summer for some length of time. But so it was very strange. I suddenly realized that my basic conditioning was that of a child of Europe, really.
So when did you make the decision to stay? Was it a few weeks or?
The decision to actually stay came much later and for very different reasons. But I came to join this friend of mine and to have some lessons in the Alexander technique from a very, very fine person, a man by the name of Patrick MacDonald, who had been a pupil of Alexander and his assistant for over 30 years. And when Alexander died, which happened in 1954, Patrick MacDonald took over his practice and continued his teaching. And it was to him that I was brought by this friend of mine. And I had 2 or 3 lessons, and I was so taken by it. It was such an extraordinary experience. I realized that I was in front of some teaching that really had extraordinary possibilities, particularly for a performing musician, I felt. I wasn't quite clear why I got so terribly enthusiastic about it, but now I can, with the perspective of so many years, I realized that I immediately sensed that there was something very great there and I wanted to learn it. So I initially decided to stay for a year in London, and I had to ride back to Jerusalem and ask them to find another teacher to take over my students there, because I did not want to lose my work in Israel. I thought I would stay in London for a year, learn as much as I can about the Alexander technique, and then go back. And there were tremendous financial problems. Coming from Israel, I barely scraped together the money to come, and a tiny bit of money to be able to sustain myself here. And then I was faced with having to pay very high fees for very expensive lessons in this technique, and I couldn't afford it. And I then realized that if I joined a teacher's training course that had started, the fee for the teacher's training course per month would equal the fee of about 4 private lessons. And if in 1 month in the training course, one was within a group of people who had the teacher working with us every day, 3 hours a day, 5 times a week. So it was a very simple calculation that made me join the teacher's training course, because I wanted to be as much as possible in contact with the teacher of it and learn as much as I could from him. And this seemed the most viable way of doing it, so I joined the teacher's training course, never intending to be a teacher of the Alexander technique, because my life was completely set on just being a pianist and performing and teaching, and that was my life. And I I borrowed money, and I did all sorts of crazy things. I immediately started meeting other students and other Israeli students, all of whom were trying to make ends meet somehow here. It was very difficult for Israelis to be in London. Financially, it was extremely difficult. It still is to this day. And some students said, "Oh, you should try the BBC." They used to have the Hebrew Hour on the BBC in those days. And apparently at that point, it was somewhere at the beginning of 1961, they were looking for a female voice to broadcast, to read the news or take part in some other readings. And one of the students suggested that I should go and have a voice test with the Hebrew Hour on the BBC. And lo and behold, I went and did it, and they said, "Yes, your voice is very radiophonic," as they called it. "We will use you. You will come. We will send you a notice each time to come and to read news." And I used to get a notice from the BBC to come to read the news in Hebrew, and for that I was paid the royal sum of 30 shillings each time, and I lived on twice that amount per week. In those days, lived maybe, I existed. There was a whole chain of strange circumstances that enabled me to stay. And after the first year of doing this Alexander course, I realized that I really would like to go further in it, that there was much more I should learn. And at that point, I approached the head of the course and I said, "I want to stay. I don't know how to manage it financially. The only thing I could do would be I could sell my piano in Israel and use the money to pay for continuing the course." And the men must have realized that the thing meant so much to me that I was willing to sell my piano, which was my only precious possession and of such importance to me, that he arranged for me. I think I was the only student that he ever did this for, because the course was privately run. He found some foundation who sponsored my studies. They paid for the following 2 years of my studies so that I could complete the 3-year course, on the understanding that once I finished and start working, I would pay them back so that they could offer that money to another student later. So I undertook to continue the course to its completion. And during that time, in fact in the second year, I met my present husband. And it was meeting Roger, and eventually after a lot of toing and froing that I made the decision to stay, to marry him and to stay in this country. But it wasn't an easy decision. I truly wanted to go back and live in Israel. Once you have spent your youth in Israel, you do feel that your place is there. And had Roger been Jewish, I would have tried to persuade him to go and live in Israel. But since he wasn't Jewish, there was no question of that. It would not have been right for him to do that. So but it took me about 2 years before I made up my mind to actually agree to stay here.
Yes. Can I ask, were you mixing much with, other than with Israelis, were you mixing much with Jews in this country?
Um, I was mixing with a lot of people very quickly. I was warned before I left Israel, you're going to England, you know. English people don't invite you to their homes very easily, and they keep themselves to themselves, and you will be lucky if you make any friends after a year or something. Within a few weeks, I was invited to several English homes, in fact not Jewish, but also Jewish homes. Yes, I knew a number of Israelis. Interestingly enough, this Alexander training course, which was the first one started after Alexander's death, consisted of a majority
You were saying
Yes, it is very interesting that the Israelis are always the first ones to recognize something of very special value and of importance, because that course was started towards the end of 1960, and out of, I think, about 12 students who formed the class, um, certainly two-thirds were Israelis. One was an Englishman, one was a Dane, there were two Canadians, there was a Swede, and that's about all. The rest of us were all Israelis. It was extraordinary. And today in Israel, there are more Alexander teachers per capita than in any other country in the world, because they recognize it's a very, very important teaching the Alexander technique, and they recognize the value of it, and they just came in droves to learn it.
Really? So you were mixing with quite a
I was
variety
mixing
of people.
with
But
Israeli
you
students
didn't
here.
join any Jewish community here?
No, but I'll tell you what happened when I was trying to make ends meet. Again, my Israeli colleagues said, there is a place in Edgware, they're looking for a Hebrew teacher in a Sunday school, in a synagogue. And that was the synagogue of Dov Marmor. You know, the Rabbi Dov Marmor in
Edgware Reform. Yes.
Edgware Reform. Do you know of him?
Oh, yes.
He is now...
Yes, I know. The Toronto. Yes,
Yes.
I know.
And he was my first employer. I went to work. He took me on as a teacher in the Sunday school there, and not a very happy situation for me, because I didn't at all feel qualified for the job, but I did my best. I prepared as much as I could every Saturday before I went up to teach. He was very, very nice, and so I was doing that, and through that, I think I was also asked, I can't remember how it came about, a young Jewish singer who was singing and was professionally engaged to sing for high holidays at North Finchley Reform Synagogue. She asked me to accompany her. And that was my first contact with the Reform synagogue during high holidays in this country. I used to accompany throughout the high holidays.
You didn't go
And
to
I
worship? Did you worship
I
at all when you
didn't.
went?
No, it was still a remnant of the sort of Israeli secular life that I was leading there. Strangely enough.
You hadn't worshipped you hadn't felt the need to worship in Israel, and you
No,
hadn't yet in this country.
the only thing in Israel, I mean, I was completely discouraged from it during the days of my marriage to my Israeli husband. The only thing I always kept was the Yom Kippur, strangely enough, and I think I was sort of, I was quite oblivious of my Jewish background. I was an Israeli, and that was that. I literally
Yes.
a sort of typical Israeli goy.
Yes.
And then what happened was that after I completed this course and I was married, then I married Roger. And
And could I just say, I know it's a very personal thing, you didn't see any particular problem then in marrying
oh,
somebody
I did see a
non-Jewish?
tremendous problem. That's
Yes.
why it took me 2 years to decide whether I liked the man very much,
Indeed.
very much more than my first Israeli husband.
Sure.
And it was obvious that the two of us ought to become partners, and but I couldn't make up my mind about it, and I would say, well, what is going to happen when if we get married and we have children? What are they? Are they going to go to the synagogue or to the church? And my husband innocently at that point said, well, they'll go wherever we go, and we weren't going anywhere at that point, you see. So eventually we decided to get married. And 2 years after we were married, our daughter was born. And it was when she was a few months old. Yes, she was born in July, so she will have been about 3 months old or something. That one day I got up and I told my husband, today is the Jewish Day of Atonement. Here was I, it's my Yom Kippur that kept me Jewish, you see. I said, it's the Day of Atonement, and I explained a few things to him about it, the little bit that I knew, and I said, so I shall prepare food for you, but I will not be eating today. And then I started walking around the house and saying, oh, what a pity, the wonderful services on this day, it's a very special day, what a pity there isn't a synagogue. And my husband said to me, we lived here in North Hungary. This was, well, Daniela was born in 1966, this was 1966, 22 years ago.
Just briefly, why did you move to North?
Because this was the house of his parents, and they put the house on for sale, and we had nowhere to live at that point. So we said, we'll sit in the house until it gets sold. And we moved in here, sitting there was all the time the for sale thing, and then I discovered that I was expecting a baby, so we decided that maybe we should stay here until the baby is born. So, etc., etc. Eventually, we took out a mortgage and we took it over from the parents who had bought a house somewhere else in Berkhamsted, and they had moved away.
Right.
And then when the baby was born, we thought it would be nice to be here with a garden. And for a while, we lived here for many years, meaning to move back into London. We have been here for a while, for the last 22 years.
I see. So that Day of Atonement, you were thinking,
And that Day of Atonement.
What a pity there isn't a synagogue.
In Daniela's first year of life, I started moping around the house and saying, what a pity, there are very moving prayers on this day. I was explaining to Roger. And what a pity there isn't, I can't be in a synagogue. He said, of course you can be in a synagogue. So I said, no, I can't, there isn't one here. So he said, but there is. So I said, oh, come on, how would you know that there is? He said, but there is a synagogue. So I said, well, even if there is, I'm not a member, so I can't go. So he looked at me and said, what kind of religion is it? On your holiest day, you can't go to pray because you're not a member? Come on. And he literally put the coat on me, and he took me down to where our first synagogue was, down in Halliwell Road. Yeah. And there were maybe about 10 people or so in the synagogue there. In 1966, not very many, maybe 20. How many would there have been? Very few. Andrew was still a student rabbi.
The afternoon was this of the...
It will have been possibly early afternoon
not so many people
of the Yom Kippur.
Yes.
And there weren't, well, the congregation was small.
Yes, so you went in.
And I went in and I sat in the corner and I had a little cry. And I listened to the services, and when it was over, I went up to somebody. Somebody greeted me. Would it have been Joan Lewis?
Maybe.
I can't remember.
Was
she was one of the founder members.
Yeah.
And she was very nice. And I said that I lived here, and could I become a member? And that's how my association with the synagogue started. And it was, in fact, I would have never known that there was one here. And my husband, my non-Jewish husband,
forced me to go there on Yom Kippur and said, what kind of religion is it if you can't go to pray on your holiest day? So that's, and from then on I never looked back. I became a member of the synagogue. And then again in a totally unforced way, some 7 or 8 years later, Daniela started going to the Sunday school.
Yes.
It happened because we had more luck than sense, I think, the two of us, because people would ask, well, how are you going to bring your daughter up? Is she going to be Jewish? Is she going to be Christian? And we said, oh, well, she will choose, which is normally not the way to proceed about things. And you know something, she chose. Quite extraordinary. When she was, I think, about 7 or something like this, I had an Israeli friend visiting who stayed here for 10 days, also a pianist, who was one of my colleagues in my young days there. And of course, when she was here and Roger was away at work, we just spoke Hebrew the whole day. And the child was milling around between us, watching in amazement this strange language that her mother was talking, which she hadn't heard before. And she watched and watched, and then she began to put on a sort of pidgin Hebrew. And she would say, ken, and lo. She picked up the ken and lo. And she would, when my friend wasn't at home, she would approach me and start pretend to speak Hebrew to me. Well, eventually the friend left, and Daniela came up to me after a few days and said, Mommy, could I also learn Israeli? Which is exactly how she said. So I said, oh, you would like to learn Hebrew? Well, there is a Sunday school at the synagogue. Would you like to go to that? Yes, please. And so Daniela went to the Sunday school. And when Daniela was 12, Roger one day told me, you know, she has come to me and asked me, she asked her father if he wouldn't mind that she should have a bat mitzvah. It was so literally she did choose. And it was very, children are wonderful, they have an amazing sense. She didn't, of course, ask me whether I would mind her having a bat mitzvah, but she went to her father and asked, would you mind, Daddy, if I had a bat mitzvah? And he came and told me this. So Daniela had her bat mitzvah in our synagogue. I don't know if you remember that. Possibly not.
Years ago.
And, I was very fortunate. Roger's family were very wonderful people. I mean, his entire family were there for Daniela's bat mitzvah.
Because you have yourself so few. No, but you had no.
I had
no
relatives. My only close relations were my mother in Australia and my sister, and her children, whom I had not yet seen by that at that point. Yes. So I became very attached to Roger's family, and his parents were absolutely wonderful people, and I called them Mummy and Daddy, and they were thrilled. Daniela was their only grandchild, because they only had Roger and Roger's sister, who was a few years younger than Roger, but who was not married. She only married much later in life. So this was the only grandchild in the family, and they absolutely adored Daniela. And they also received me with great warmth into their family. So they were very, very kind and very loving. So I had a wonderful relationship with them.
Now, does Roger, in fact, a practicing Christian?
Very loosely. I mean, we've just last week been to a funeral service of his aunt. So really, and I installed the Passover Seder in our house. Roger has not. Roger doesn't go to church. So but he goes to church on unfortunately. I have been with Roger to church for weddings and for funerals. Yeah. And when after Roger's father died, on my suggestion, we took his mother on Christmas morning to church. But otherwise, he actually doesn't know.
He's not a regular or committed, so there isn't a
There's no
but
conflict.
but
There's
you
no
know,
conflict also because of
he doesn't though have a commitment for you to support him in that side.
not really, but I think that we have a very broad view of Judeo-Christian religious background between us, so that I think we respect the wider implications of of Judaism and Christianity. And I mean, it could not have been possible were I an Orthodox Jewess, but then of course I wouldn't have married him. And Roger has often come with me to the synagogue, to some synagogue services, and he did not find it in any way difficult for him to deal with. Roger became very friendly with Bill Simpson also, and it was what I felt it was very nice for Roger to meet a man who was such a Christian, who became so closely involved with liberal Judaism and with our synagogue. So it was nice for Roger as well. But I don't think it's ever been a problem for him or for me, and it's no problem for me to go with Roger to a Christian service. Absolutely not.
Talking of types of service, you had no problem in falling in with the liberal service because you had hardly any recollection in your very youngest childhood of any services in Poland. So
none. I only had recollections of the tradition being kept at home. I know that it was a kosher home. I remember how the house was cleansed from top to bottom for Pesach, and how a special big basket of dishes was pulled out from somewhere for use during Pesach, and how everything. I mean, and every Erev Shabbat, I remember the mother lighting candles and baking challah and cooking gefilte fish, etc., etc. The home traditions I remember from that, and father praying. Yes, at home, yes.
But you didn't have
But I don't remember services. They must have taken me, but I can't remember that.
Too young. Yes.
You see, I was barely 6 when the war started.
Indeed.
So I don't really.
So really, that brings us more or less up to date. Except, would you like to say? Yes. Just by the way, just briefly, Roger's own career.
Roger,
yes.
You will laugh. He's an architect.
Yes.
When I met Roger, and I liked him very much the first time we met, and then when I asked him what he was doing, and he said that he was an architect, my heart missed a beat.
What his career has been, yes. I presume he's interested in music.
Oh, yes. Roger studied music for many, many years. He studied the piano for many years. And in fact, when he lived with his parents in Northwood, he ran a choir here. And then he went to study architecture, and when he was already working as an architect, he decided to go to the Guildhall School of Music for 1 year on a conductor's course. And then he formed an orchestra and a choir in London, and he was conducting, and they put some operatic performances. And he began to really hope that he would switch careers and be a conductor rather than an architect. But as he started it rather late, sort of in his mid-30s, it was extremely difficult to break into the profession. It's a very competitive profession. And to be able to earn a living.
Yes.
So he worked part-time as an architect and tried to do some music, and everything he earned as an architect he was losing on his concerts. And then he met me, and eventually, gradually, more and more, he began to support the development of my career and gave up his own music making, which probably is a pity, but it wouldn't have been possible for both of us to be musicians. We would have starved, I think.
So your own music, so that at least he was able to support and encourage you all the
very much
yes.
So, yes. Oh, absolutely. Without his support, I'm sure my career wouldn't have developed as well in this country, because I came here, had I studied here as a youngster, it's a natural development. You finish your Academy of Music here, and if you're outstanding, you have all the doors are open for you much more easily. But coming in from the outside as an already fairly established young musician in another country, and here at first I was not allowed to have a work permit. I wasn't, for several years I wasn't allowed to do anything in music here. So I was really quietly sitting in the corner, nobody knowing anything about it. And it took quite many years for me to be accepted. Then eventually I was invited to teach at the Guildford School of Music. And then eventually I began to perform on the BBC and other public concerts and so on. So it all developed gradually.
Took time,
but it took quite many years.
I mean, you now have a fairly substantial reputation as a concert pianist.
And as a teacher, and I give a lot of master classes, and people come to me now from literally from many countries in the world to the master classes that I give here, and I keep being invited to other countries. In fact, I have a prospect in October of going to Canada, to the western states of America, and to Virginia, and to New York, for combined master classes and concerts. So gradually my career has developed internationally and here. But it was very gradual, and it took quite a number of years before I began to be known.
The Alexandra technique, which you took, you say the 3 years studying, that has helped, that you are a leading exponent of that?
Yes, because you see, I completed the course in 1963. So that's 25 years ago. And since then, I have been doing a great deal of research in trying to incorporate Alexander's teaching into playing an instrument, into the work of a musician. And I have become probably the leading exponent of this combination of using the Alexander principle in playing or singing. I've also been involved in courses for singers where I would introduce them to the teaching of Alexander. And so I am, yes, that has been sort of become accidentally my special field of expertise, and many people come to me to learn about that.
You have obviously no doubt that this particular technique of relaxation, is that where
it's of coordination, of general coordination. It's tremendously valuable. Oh, it's now become so popular in most of the big music establishments in this country, in the States, in some other countries in Europe. Now teach the Alexander technique as an important aid in the development of a musician. And when I came to this country, hardly anybody knew of it. People were laughing when I told them I'm learning the Alexander technique. They said, "What is that?" And now it is taught at the Royal Academy of Music, at the Royal College of Music, at the Guildford School of Music, at the Royal Scottish Academy, absolutely in all the major music institutions in this country, many in the United States, and it's gradually spreading more and more. I've just been on tour in the Far East, and I was giving classes in Melbourne at the Victoria College of Arts music school, where they employ an Alexander teacher. I was giving courses in Sydney and at Auckland University in New Zealand, and I possibly will be going back to the Far East next year, also to maybe to Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong, but I was playing there, but I might be going to do some teaching there, and possibly in China.
So you enjoy traveling now, do you?
I enjoy being in all those other countries. I hate the traveling, but oh yes, I love the
experience
challenge
of the other countries and the stimulus of meeting other musicians and students.
Absolutely.
Is interesting. Yes.
By the way, when I went to Hong Kong, Rabbi Brito introduced me to a leading person there in the Jewish community of Hong Kong, and the Israeli cultural attaché put me in touch with the consul in Hong Kong. They don't have an embassy there, they have a consulate. And so in Hong Kong I celebrated Israel's Independence Day at a reception given by the Israeli consul, where I met many of the leading members of the Jewish community.
Really?
Yes.
You have you in fact have you had how should I put yourself in Jewish music, or if one can say such a thing, music with particular Jewish themes or by particularly Jewish composers? How much feeling do you have for this now? Or
My only connection with this, I would say, would be with Israeli composers. But it's a very interesting question, actually. There is music. I've never gone into this, but I have a friend, an American pianist, a woman pianist, who has actually looked into the Jewish aspect of music for piano. I have never really. The piano repertoire is for about 5 lifetimes. It is the instrument endowed with the largest repertoire. And there is so much music that one wants to learn, and one doesn't have sufficient time for it, that one has to of necessity limit the field within which one operates. But Israeli composers, I have even broadcast here on the BBC some works by Paul Ben-Chaim. And I want to suggest, as this is the 40th year of Israel, I was going to suggest to a producer who is particularly interested in Israel to do some further recordings of some music by Israeli composers. So I would say more an Israeli connection than Jewish.
Right. Okay. And have you been back to Israel much since you left?
Yes, I do go, and whenever I go to Israel, I record always a lot for the radio there, and I think they have about, I don't know, hours of recordings of me playing various things. And from time to time I would get a letter from somebody saying, "Oh, I heard you on the radio last week." Needless to say, this is completely a labor of love because radios are notoriously underpaying artists, but Israel is the most underpaid of all of them. It's a labor of love.
You keep in touch with your former students?
Absolutely, yes. Some of whom are now in the leading positions in the music life of Israel, yes.
That's nice. Just coming back here to Northwood and Pinner and our congregation, of which, of course, this is the part of the Oral History Archive. You've been a member, you say, since that day you went in Halliwell Road.
Yes.
I know you've taken services from time to time. That has been, have you contributed, have you done anything else much there? Of course, you've been so busy.
I have done concerts.
Indeed.
That had to do with fundraising.
Yes.
Done services, and generally in the earlier days I was professionally less busy, and I used to be more involved in the sort of day-to-day activities like building a sukkah and doing various things, baking for a fair and so on. But as I have got increasingly more and more engaged professionally, I have really almost no time for that. But I always I was very, very touched when I was first asked to take a service. To me, this congregation has meant a lot to me. The synagogue has meant a great deal to me, and I feel that it was almost, as it were, preordained that I should get back to my Judaic links through this. It's very interesting because. And it is interesting, you see, it was because when I was married to a non-Jewish person, that I then felt the need to establish my spiritual identity.
And your daughter Daniela, of course, she has maintained a Jewish identity.
Oh, absolutely. And she went to Israel. I mean, she's been to Israel with us several times as a youngster. But for her 21st birthday, we kept asking what would she like, what special treat. And finally she came up with a suggestion. I would like you to send me to Israel for my 21st birthday, which was really wonderful. Now she has a cousin there. My sister's eldest daughter is married to an Israeli, and she lives in Israel. She has 2 children, and so Daniela is very close with her. So She went and stayed with her cousin, and she was supposed to be there for a month, and after a week she telephoned us and said, could you please change my ticket to another month's stay? And she loves Israel, and this year she went again for a month, and she keeps saying that she would like, depending on what happens with her studies and so on, that she really would like to go and spend a longer time in Israel, and she's very, very, very connected to it and very close. And she is really Jewish. She's elected to be Jewish, and really nobody steered her one way or another. And it came, as I said, we always have a very big seder in our house. I have 2 close Israeli girlfriends of my age. And the 3 of us always do it between ourselves. We sort of change it around between us. Mostly we do it in my house, unless I have a concert just the day before or the day after, then we do it in another friend's house. So she's very steeped in some of the traditions. As far as I can, I keep the Erev Shabbat at home. And Roger is very kind, because he will set up the table and put the candles on and put the wine on the table and buy the challah, and very often he knows that we keep that tradition. And now that Daniela has moved away from the house, we still have it. We light, with Roger, I light the candles, and we have a kiddush and blessing of challah and wine. But Daniela also, for Christmas she would always go to her grandparents, and when they became very old, I would arrange Christmas for them here, and they would come to stay with us. So she was exposed to the 2 traditions, but I would say on my part it was possibly more intensive, and I was really involved with the synagogue, and Daniela was involved with the synagogue, so it became. Roger thinks that maybe it's my dramatic past that drew her closer to the Jewish side of her background. I don't know, it's very mysterious, because certainly we did not do what people would expect one to do, to choose for your child in which tradition you're going to bring him or her up. And she literally chose for herself.
That's interesting.
Very, very interesting.
One little question about Jessica's, your professional stage, your professional concert name, Nelly Ben Or.
That was my name, the name from my first marriage. And since I began to be known under that name, I was already performing in Israel, and I came here under that name.
Yes.
And then when we were married, of course my married name is Clynes, but we decided that since I already began to be known as a pianist, as Nelly Ben Or, and it was an easy name for anybody to pronounce anywhere. So we kept that name as my professional name.
Right. Well, thank you. I think that's. Have you any final thought on a life which has been not without its interest, but has, I might say, has all ended happily? Any final thought on?
Well, I think what's wonderful is that when I have to think about completing now what I have written about my past, and it was going to be just that, writing about the war years and ending with my going to Israel. And now I decided that I would like to write in greater detail about the sort of things that we have just been speaking now, my development as a musician. Because there's something very wonderful about the fact that there is this constant movement in life, that out of the dark one can come into light, and something can grow out of this. And I have no doubt that in some ways I have been possibly irreparably damaged by the war experiences, in some ways psychologically, without doubt. I also have had a great deal of help. But the Alexander technique is a very great help in healing a person. I have also had much psychotherapy, without which I think I would not have been able to cope. I would have probably had the kind of severe breakdown that my sister had I not had much psychotherapy.
Israel, this country?
It started just before I left Israel. I began to have some psychotherapy, and then I came to this country, and I had to have it here because I really hit some very, very difficult moments.
Really?
And without it, I would have been. After some years of therapy, the person who was working with me said, "Well, in those early days, I thought that you might not be able to pull through, and we would have to hospitalize you." It was as difficult as that. That I didn't talk about. We were talking about the good things that happened in my life, but this was. It was a painful process, and very enlightening. It has helped me in many respects as a person, as a teacher, as a parent, I suppose, although there isn't such a thing as a good parent. But it has been very enlightening, and it has been healing to an extent, but it also has shown me some things that can almost not be healed. And yet, thank the Lord, really, that thanks to all this help that I've reached out for and received, I have been able to develop as an artist, and otherwise I might not have been able to do that. I think all these things together, the bad experiences, as I said, the awful darkness, dark night of those war years, have both left irreparable scars, but they have also, in my case, given material from which something could grow, something of value. And I think that's wonderful. That's a tremendous blessing. I do not say that it was a blessing to have the Holocaust, but since the Holocaust did happen, I personally say it was a blessing that I was enabled later to draw on some of the resources that it opened up possibly.
Just one little personal thing that when you're completing your family picture, your mother, is she still alive in Australia?
No, my mother died. She died some 12 years ago or so in Australia.
Did you get to see her then?
I got to see her a year before she died. Oh, she came to us. First of all, she spent about a year here when Daniela was just over 2. She came to stay with us for 2 months, and I kept not letting her go. Eventually, after about a year, she had to go. And then we went to the bar mitzvah of my sister's son. At that point, Daniela was about, I can't remember, 8 or something like this. So there we had a wonderful, very wonderful, moving, happily reunion of all that remains of our family. Yes.
So you were able, to see her then shortly.
So I saw my
before she
mother
died.
there. I was with my sister and with her 2 daughters and the youngest son. We had his bar mitzvah, and that was a lovely occasion. And Daniela has a very great sense for the family and for the past. I think very strong. I mean, she loves the other side of the family. She was extremely attached to her grandmother and grandfather here, and she was absolutely devastated when finally the grandmother died also. Daniela was then in her mid-teens, and it was a tremendous blow to her because she adored her grandmother. And yet she has a very special feeling for my family and for all this Jewish connection. It seems to her part of her own existence. Very, very interesting.
Well, thank you, Nelly. There's one technical point about the copyright in this interview on these 2 tapes which I've taken from you. Do you, this is the normal question, that I presume you agree that copyright in these tapes resides in the NPLS Oral History Archive. Now, if there's anything in what has been said which you think you would not want made available to historians, then you should say. But otherwise, I would assume it can be made available for research and for future historians' use.
I should think so. As far as I can remember from the various tapes
Yes.
that we took, I should think that
But you
I
would
wouldn't
agree
mind
to
it.
that? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.